Okay, so we're going to talk about Imperial Japan, kind of their traditions and society, and then the idea of the shogun and how these shoguns kind of centralized the government in Japan. Before then, it was very feudalistic. We'll also talk a little bit about the emperor, and then we will talk a little bit about their society right before the West really enters Japan. This flower is a chrysanthemum, which is the imperial symbol, and it's a symbol of power and beauty. So a few of the traditions or religions of Japan are Shintoism, Buddhism. We already talked a little bit about Confucianism, and then we'll discuss a little bit about samurais. Shinto literally means way of the gods. It means there's a spirit in everything. There's a definition called kami, K-A-M-I, which means gods, and the sun goddess is at top. This is a very loosely organized theology, so to speak. But around 26 CE, which means Common Era. I don't know if we've talked about this. CE means Common Era, and that's what AD used to mean, and BCE is before Common Era, which means obviously what BC used to. But anyways, around 26 BC, or I'm sorry, CE, they have records of an emperor. It was always male heirs. These aren't written records, but passed down orally. But he is sacred and divine. And the interesting thing about emperors is the emperor of Japan was sacred and divine until 1947, when the U.S. came in and they became a constitutional monarchy. So that's kind of interesting. For 2,000 years, the emperor was sacred and divine. Shinto emphasizes purity of your mind and your body. They have a gate at every shrine, so you will know where it is, and the emperor is the highest priest. So much like many civilizations, the emperor is God on earth, so to speak. It's kind of the same for the emperor in Japan. There are precepts. There's 10 precepts. They're very ordered, just like Confucianism. We won't go through all 10, but some of them are: you don't go against the gods. You don't violate the state. The world is one family. And perhaps most importantly to the Japanese, because they stay very close, just like the Chinese, is you don't get carried away with foreign teachings. Now, Japan's very hard to get to unless by boat, and it was not an easy place to get to until the Europeans came around. So we have to remember this is quite pretty isolated society up until the 1600s. Along with Shintoism is Buddhism, and the Buddha lived in the 6th century, and I'm sure we've all seen pictures of him. There are two sections of Buddhism. There's a big vehicle, which means you take anyone if you believe. There's no class, race, sex, etc. holding you back. This is what Japan, China, and Korea worship as far as Buddhism is concerned. And then there's also a small vehicle, which is much more orthodox and more Southeast Asian, not so much up in China and Japan. So since Japan is a big vehicle, you can believe in Buddhism and Shintoism and follow Confucianism all at the same time. Okay, so a lot of people believe Buddhism is also a way of life. Last PowerPoint we talked about karma, and this is really where karma comes from, is Buddhism, and like we talked about the basic ideas. If you do good things will happen to you. If you do bad, at some point that will catch up to you. Do bad things to other people, and that will catch up to you, and bad things will happen to you. So that really comes from Buddhism. Much like Shintoism and Confucianism, it's also very structured. So in Buddhism there's 4 noble truths, and the first truth is life is suffering. The second truth is the origin of suffering is that you get attached to things, and when Buddha said things, it's exactly what he meant. He said people get too materialistic, and this is in the 500s, right? He says people get tied to money, tied to houses, tied to clothes, tied to how they look, things like that, things of earthly value. And he said this is the origin of why you suffer, because we get too attached to them. But the third noble truth is you can cease to be attached to these. You can live your life in a way that you will benefit from without being attached to all of these materials that we think that we need. I mean, that's the American dream today, a lot of people say. And the fourth noble truth is that the path to perfection is midway between asceticism, which is, being a monk, completely cutting yourself off from the world, and hedonism, which is getting everything that you want, not necessarily what you need, but hedonism is kind of having things that you don't need. And the Buddha says, if you can split that down the middle, that's the pathway to perfection. And when you do that, and you attain all these four noble truths, you will attain nirvana, which is, when you attain nirvana, that means it's freedom from all worries, troubles, complications. But if you've never attained nirvana, then you don't know what it is. Okay, and he says not very many people attain this. It's kind of like Confucius. He says it's hard, but you can do it. But if you've never done it, then you don't know if you've got it or not. So when you do get nirvana, you'll know. Some sects, S-E-C-T-S, sects of Buddhism. There's a whole bunch, but we'll just talk about the Zen, since everybody kind of knows what Zen is. This came from China, and the Zen Buddhism taught that enlightenment didn't come from education or going to school or intellectual processes, but by a sudden flash of insight experienced when one is in tune with nature. Okay? So it's just like this, bam, all of a sudden you have this complete calm feeling. And at the same time, Zen's, the way to attain this is physical discipline, self-control, and meditation. So this is why the Zen really appealed to the warrior class, which are the samurai, because that's kind of what the samurai based their life on, right? Physical discipline, self-control, and meditation. And since we already talked about Confucianism last PowerPoint, we don't need to, but this was also a part of Japanese culture, this whole social order structuring of things. So in the 9th century, you get these warrior class in Japan, and they're called the samurai. Somewhere in the 800s, nobody's really sure. But samurai means those who serve. So basically what samurai are is they were armed guards for landlords, because Japan at the time was not politically stable. So basically they were security guards, right, for the rich. But as they became more important and there became more of them, they became their own social class. But it wasn't hereditary. So if you were a samurai and you had a son born, that doesn't mean he was a samurai. He had to train for it and become one on his own. They were very well educated, they were efficient, and they lived by what is called the Bushido Code, which is basically their code of honor, which meant loyalty was key. If there was dishonor, then you had to fall on your sword. Right? It's just like a knight's code, kind of European knight code. It stressed valor and loyalty, and his samurai's whole life was about protecting, defending, or avenging his lord by sacrificing his life. Or you have to harikiri, which is fall on your own sword. So if for some reason you were defending your landlord and he died, you would then go travel and find the people who killed him, and then if somehow you beat them and killed them, then since your landlord died, you would have to kill yourself after that. That's what harikiri is. So it was a very structured social class, and one that was really at its height of its power right before the West gets to Japan. Okay, so this slide we're gonna talk about Japan and its feudal state, and then how it kind of slowly becomes a very centralized government with actually dual governments. The first one we'll talk about is the Bakufu government, which you can see went from 1185 to 1868. This literally means 10th government. Before this was put to test, Japan was basically a very feudalistic society, meaning you had mounted warriors, basically, who owned land. They dominated the peasantry, and they kind of exercised government power as a private right. So they would run their little land holdings as its own government. This was hereditary, and they would make contracts with one another, to keep power. If one felt like they were losing power, then another one would come in and help, just to make sure that things ran conservatively, or how they always did run. Like Europe, the small landowners gave away land for protection, kind of like a roof or extortion money. And also like Europe, the church, whether it be Shinto or Buddhist or Confucius centers, what have you, they also owned a lot of land. This began to change when the 10th government came into effect. The Bakufu government was headed by a shogun, and this shogun commanded the military. The shogun was actually a title given to him by the emperor, and this started from 1185 up until for the next 700 years. It was a whole idea of rule versus reign. Okay, so the Bakufu government was established by the Minamoto family, and they said they were working for the emperor, but in reality, for the next 700 years, you had a dual government. You had the civil authority at Kyoto, who was headed by the emperor, and embracing, various ranks of court nobility, basically ornaments, so to speak. But when the Minamoto family came along, they started to rule. So the emperor was reigning. The emperor was what we would consider as royalty today, like the British, very much like the British, right? The British have a queen and a prince, and everybody cares about what those people do, but the real people who actually run the country, there are, David Cameron, the Prime Minister, the Parliament. That's the actual government. They're the people who are ruling. And that's what this Bakufu was. It was a dual government. Despite all of this very decentralized country, if you can't really even call it a country, land at the time, the Bakufu government and the shoguns really unified the country in the hands of these leaders. And the whole idea behind this was that Japan was passing from this feudalistic knightly class of armed warriors to large estate owners. Okay, so you have the shogun, which literally means the king of the samurais, who's running the government, and then you have the emperor, who's in Kyoto, just kind of as an ornament. And then in the 15th century, you get these people called the daimyos, which translate into great names. So what was happening is these large landholders were starting to accumulate land, and so less and less landowners owned more and more land. That's kind of the problem that all countries have into today, right? The small farms were getting soaked up into the big ones. The thing that they did do, these daimyos, is when you have less people running these estates, they become more centralized, and they didn't necessarily reduce feudal tension throughout the land, but they reduced the number of rival units, and they ensured a measure of stability, within these. So these daimyos aren't necessarily running the government, but they are very large landholders who do have a say in the government. Okay, these daimyos become very powerful, and they start recruiting samurais to overthrow the Ashikaga. The Ashikaga from 1392 to 1573 were the shogun family. It was passed down hereditarily, and the daimyos in the 14th century started trying to overthrow these. They all wanted to take over because they all wanted to be shogun, right? So they had a lot of fights. They would kind of sync up with each other, and some people would fight for Ashikaga, and some people would fight against him and that family, and then they would have, little wars, and then Ashikaga would win, and then they would give daimyos more power, this and that. So for the next 150 years, it was very violent on the Japanese soil. While this is happening, around 1500, these people have been warring for 110 years, and then around 1500 is what happened with Sengoku, which basically means country at war. So for the next 100 years, it was basically all-out war, a civil war between all of these daimyos fighting to become the shogun. At the same time, you have peasants who want autonomy because they see all these people fighting, and they realize that they can get out from under the yoke of these big daimyos. So you have peasants who are looking for autonomy. They're starting to rebel. So from 1500 to 1600, Japan was a very, very violent place. Robbery, pillage. Basically, the central government disappears, and even the emperor, his land starts being absorbed into feudal lands, and he basically loses all power whatsoever. There's a saying that one of the emperors had to eke out a living by selling autographs, right? So this is a country that, kind of like the Civil War in America, although in the Civil War in America, the government stayed stable throughout. The North governments and the Southern government, they stayed stable throughout. But from 1500 to 1600, government fell, the shogun was losing power, and it was basically all-out war. Okay, here's a slide of Tokugawa, Japan. You can go back to this. We'll talk about Tokugawa. He was the last of the three great unifiers of Japan, and he is the person who centralized Japan, and they ruled until 1868. So here you have kind of the trading. He opened up Japan with trading. He put highways, created infrastructure, sea routes, and he centralized much of the commercial areas of Japan. You have to remember, Japan is a very mountainous island, right? They don't have a lot of natural resources, and they don't have a lot of places where they can grow food. So the more centralized and the more peaceful the population is, the better it is for everybody. And that's what Tokugawa did. Okay, so real quickly, we'll just go to what in Japanese history is called the three great unifiers: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. As you can see, Oda was kind of the beginning of the unifiers, even though him and Hideyoshi lived during the time of the Civil War. They're the ones who set the actual unification, in order, and then Tokugawa just completely took over and centralized the state. Nobunaga was the son of a samurai. He was a military commander under the Ashikaga shogunates. He's the one who seized Kyoto, and not only placed the emperor under his rule, but he also placed the reigning shogun under his rule. but he was a very brutal man, and he actually got killed by one of his own generals. So he, even though he did try to take over for the emperor and the shogun who he was working for, he started this process of trying to get Japan under one government. Okay, and he was brutal. He killed a lot of people to get there. Eventually, he was put down in a coup, essentially. The person who followed him was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he was a lack of a surname. He has a lack of a surname, so he adopted Toyotomi, which means abundant provider. By 1590, he had persuaded most of the daimyos to accept his authority. So he's kind of the person who ends the civil war. The problem with him is he started unifying Japan, and so what he did then is he got greedy and he invaded Korea to get to mainland China to try and take over China, but he failed. Basically, he did this because he invited the Koreans to help him, but they didn't because they were tribute state to China, like we talked about in the tribute system. So instead of, just invading China, he gets mad at Korea and he invades them with about 160,000 soldiers. But he gets killed in Korea. So once he gets killed, the Japanese just pack up and they leave and they go back. Neither of these guys were completely able to dominate the daimyos, but they were both compelled to make alliances to destroy others, so they tried to get as many as they could on their side to kind of take out the rest of them to centralize the government. A lot like how the monarchies came to power in Europe. That's kind of how these families became powerful in Europe, right? They started making alliances and they started taking over, piece by piece. One thing Hideyoshi did that was very good is he gave control to locals. So he would go to a daimyo and he would say, I'll pledge to me and I'll let you kind of do what you want to. If you don't, I'm going to take you over by force. But if you do, your life will be the same. All I'm asking for you is loyalty. So when I need warriors, you need to send me warriors. What he did was he went around with what he called sword hunts, and he would disarm the population. Anybody who wasn't a samurai, he would take their swords away from them. So he kind of pacified the countryside by taking their weapons from them. And all of this was to centralize, right? All this was to keep a peaceful Japan so that once peace reigned, the economy could start to flourish and the government could be centralized. As you can see, it actually worked, because by the time he was killed in Korea, the Civil War had basically come to an end. So after him came Tokugawa Ieyasu, and we'll talk about him on the next slide. And he is kind of the person who was given credit for centralizing the Japanese state. And that. Okay, so we'll talk about Tokugawa Ieyasu a little bit. As you can see from the picture on the right, he went from basically a warlord to a government official. And when you become a government official, apparently you don't have to do as much, so you get really big. We'll talk a little bit about his rule and then kind of society underneath him. He's what people consider the beginner of what is called the Great Peace. He followed president by going through the Bakufu government, composed of daimyos and elders. But now, even though they had the dual government with the emperor on one side and the shogun Tokugawa on top and the Bakufu government underneath him, by the time of Tokugawa, the Bakufu government was doing everything. His rule of the power was very vertical, right? He was at the top and everybody else was below him. It was a very top-down society. It was not a democracy. A big percentage of the staff were his friends. He ruled through force and political structure. even though he centralized, he basically ran Japan like his own little feudal society, right? He had a very good, he was the lord and everybody else was his vassal. He also had something that everybody who gains control of the country wants, and that is a good secret police. He knew what was going on around Japan before it happened, essentially, right? Throughout history, the governments who really want to control their people, the first thing they do is have a good secret police. By 1617, all of the daimyos were loyal to him. He makes basically the first law code in Japanese history. There were 32 national laws, which were based on Confucianism's social order, right? It's very hierarchical. He divided the state into 250 domains, which he called Hans, and each one was led by a daimyo who was handpicked by him, right? So they were loyal to him. He also had what is called a Fudai and a Tozama. Fudai means inside, so he had some daimyos who he trusted, and they would be on the inside of his government, and he would listen to them, and they would have a lot of power. But most of the daimyos were what were called Tozama, or kind of outsiders. In theory, he gave these daimyos autonomy, since they were able to support themselves with taxes, but really he guaranteed their loyalty by what is called the hostage system, and it's really quite genius what this is. So what he did is he made each daimyo who ran a han, 250 of them in Japan, he made each have a home on the land that he owned, and then he also made them have a home in Edo. Since Tokugawa was the daimyo of Edo, that's where he set up his government. Edo would eventually become Tokyo, right? So they were compelled to have two residences, and every year they were forced to make an appearance in Edo, and they had to stay there with their whole entourage for a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever. They were forced to come to Edo and pay tribute to him. So they would bring taxes, they would bring the goods that their region supplied, whether it was rice or silk or, cash crops, sugar, fish, forest products, anything that you can think of that came from their region. They would bring that to Tokugawa, and they would give it to him as fealty, so to speak. The other interesting thing he did is he made you, if you were a daimyo, he made you leave some of your family there year-round. So that kind of ensured your loyalty, right? If your daughter or your son or, your son's family had to live in Edo all the time and they were near Tokugawa, and if you did anything to make him upset, you knew that he had your family really close to him. So he was very ingenious in that way. Okay, also what was very smart is he was the first person to really create an infrastructure in Japan. So he created the roads, he created the canals, the aqueducts, things like that. And so he owned those roads, so you had to pay a toll to be on them. He owned the inns on those roads, so you had to pay, when you were paying to stay the night on your way to Edo, you were essentially paying him, right? So everything you did, money-wise, economically, came back to the government in Tokyo, or Edo, at the time. So it was a very authoritative bureaucracy, okay, so to speak. At this time, it was a very rigid society based on class. They began to establish Confucius schools to send daimyo children to, which keeps this structure and this encouraging education. He also, like I said, he passed a lot of new laws. You can't travel abroad. Foreigners weren't allowed in. No new ideas. And as long as this occurs, everything will be okay and we'll keep the peace. And he actually did. He made it was this iron fist kind of rule, but he also made Japan quite peaceful. So the four classes were warrior, farmer, artisan, and merchant. It should be noted that since there wasn't a need for a strong warrior class anymore, because when there's peace you don't need warriors, right? You don't need samurais. it starts to become hereditary to set themselves apart from the peasants. They began to rank themselves from 1 to 100, and which became more prestigious. And they were, even though there was no need for a warrior class, they were still the only people in Japan who were allowed to carry weapons. They had two swords, one on each side. But a lot of them became bureaucrats or landowners because there was no need for them anymore once the fighting had stopped. Below them were the farm, and they were still at the top of the social ladder, even though there was no real need for them because they were the most educated. Then you had the farmers, which are pretty self-explanatory. Artisans, basically the townspeople, people who were making the pots and the pans, and carpenters, people of that stature. And then you had the merchants at the bottom of the social class, even though the merchants probably made more money than artisans and farmers, and maybe even warriors. Like we talked about in Confucianism, merchants were parasites. They were immoral, they were unethical, because they didn't use their muscles, right? They used their brains. But eventually, they'll become powerful, just like in all other societies, right? They'll become their own class. As peace came, things began to become more structured and more stable. So when you have this, we have what is called urbanization, and I'm sure all of you guys have heard of this. Once peace comes, the population increases, the economy gets going better, you have more people and they need somewhere to go. So cities began to grow very large. In fact, this is when Edo at the time had over 1 million people, which was by far the largest city in the world at the time. I mean, there's no comparison. Much larger than any European city. Like I said, this is kind of what happens when you have a peaceful, prosperous society. Also, these castle towns started being built up, which is a very European thing, right? The daimyo would build this castle, and a town would form around it. So he would put his samurais on the outskirts, and then they would build a wall, and around the wall would be the town, and then each castle town had its own section. Here's where the artisans lived, here's where the merchants lived, here's where the Buddhists lived, here's where the Shinto temple was, things like that, kind of like a whole bunch of Chinatowns or what have you. And all of this urbanization and all of this peace just made the shogun more and more powerful. Like I said, and also with urban life, you get the bad things that come with it. You get prostitutes, bars, crime, things like that, but you also get the good things with urbanization. You get theaters, anything modern, theaters, education, parks, schools, literacy went through the roof in Japan. Farmers markets, things like that. Choice for things. This is all due to Tokugawa and his great peace, and that's also the commercial expansion, right? So he creates this peace, he creates this economic vitality. So then he also makes a national currency, a mint, kind of a weights and measures system, right? This much gold is worth this much, period. He creates a postal system, which is very important on the roads that he built and owned, right? And at this time, as urbanization continues, you get merchant houses that they become very important. And by the 1800s, merchant houses will lead to full industry. These merchant houses become very powerful, and they begin to control the finances, and they begin attracting samurai who can't fight anymore, so they become educated and they start becoming merchants. And things were looking very up for Japan at this time. As things become peaceful and more prosperous, a vital culture begins to bloom in Japan at the time, and it's called the floating, fleeting world, and this is all centered around Edo and the shogun. Okay, Edo society from 1600 to 1850 flourished with creativity and things. There were two kind of basic principles of it, and one of them was called Ukiyo, which means floating world, and this really helps describe the urban lifestyle at the time and its pleasure-seeking aspects. At this time in Edo, there were licensed red light districts, which had brothels, tea houses, kabuki theaters, frequented by what was beginning to happen in Japan is they were getting a growing middle class, right? So these were all centered towards these people. Ukiyo-e, or what are the pictures of the floating world, and they depict scenes of geishas and actors and sumo wrestlers and samurai and prostitutes, like you can see on the bottom right. Things of this nature. I mean, it was, in a sense, it was kind of a world. It was a frivolous age, but it was a world of thought, and it was the world of the here and the now, right? It's these people who are middle class saying, listen, I've made money and now I want to spend it and I want to enjoy life. And so that's what they do. It kind of constituted everyday life. Specialty clothing shops, festivals, accessories, imaginations, parks, doing things just for the fun of it, going to a park and flying a kite, right? This kind of idea that you have time to spare, okay, and you enjoy it. It's kind of the everyday world. It's the world of the here and now. It's something that you can touch and you can feel, and you can pinpoint it. It was very ambitious, right? It was a time when people were making money and they were going out and they were having a good time. That's the bottom line. And this idea of a chonin comes into effect, and this means persons of the town. So what it becomes is, before Tokugawa, there was not a sense of urbanization, or I am from this town. It was more regional, it was more daimyo-centric, right? But in Edo society, you get this idea that I am a person who lives in a city. I am chonin, right? I'm a city folk. I'm a city slicker, right? And that was okay. Before this, there was no such thing. Now there's a homophone to this, which basically means it's very close. The characters are very close in Japanese to Yu-Gi-Oh! You just have to change a few of them. And this is called the sorrowful world. And this is a very Buddhist idea. The actual characters mean sorrow, grief, distress, or melancholy, so to speak. This was a very Buddhist or kind of religious type of connotation, right? It implies that the world is transitory, right? But it also implies that the present reality was ephemeral, or it was an illusion. It was a preparatory stage before a meaningful afterlife. Alright, so it's this sorrowful world, which is written almost exactly like this frivolous world. Basically it's telling you this life is an illusion, okay? You're just here to do two things. It was basically the Buddhist idea that life is sorrow, and your day-to-day life is just, it's an illusion. It isn't real. This emphasis on temporary escape and enjoyment, and this middle-class idea of making money and spending it, that's all bunk, basically, right? This is very un-Buddhist things to do, which is very interesting that the sorrowful world and the floating world are so closely, they can be so closely written together and mean two very different things. one interesting thing that I would like to point out about society before we move on is that these merchant families, which Japan never had, right, until the 1600s, these people, and we'll talk a lot about this with Europe, because Europe is really where this idea of being middle class comes from, especially the American idea of what a middle class is today. But in Japan, it's the same thing. They're not pretending to be aristocrats or the samurai, and they're not poor either, right? They are distinct social order. They're not militaristic. They're not merchants. They don't really care about high culture, as you can see from this painting, and I'll show you a few more. They're not interested in being prim and proper. They're saying, hey, we're middle class, we read popular books, we visit prostitutes, we go to dances, we go to art festivals, we go to theaters, we do everything that middle class people do. So there's also this sense as well that there never was before. So it's somewhat interesting. It's very interesting how these things happen in Japan kind of around the same time that they're happening in Europe. Actually, Europe is a little later to this, but they do happen in distant places, and the institutions are kind of the same. But we'll talk about that. Okay, so here are some ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world, right? These are probably courtesans or prostitutes or geishas maybe, and you can see that these women are living a frivolous lifestyle, right? They have all the nice things. They're all done up. They look like they're going out, and they look like they're getting ready to go out and have fun. Here are just some more examples of this idea of diversions and delights, right? There's a park on your right, people flying kites, and on the left there's probably a tea house, and a lot of, each has its own room, and, bad things may or may not occur in those rooms, but here's a painting of it, and at the time this was okay, right? It's just one way to live your life, to relieve stress, and to enjoy life. So we'll end with kind of the beginning of the West reaching Japan. They had reached Japan before Tokugawa came to power, but we'll talk about him now. Actually, the Portuguese landed in 1543, and it was an accident. It was a monsoon. They didn't even know Japan was there, right? They got lost, and they ended up landing in Japan. But the one thing they did have is they had guns, and the Japanese call them democratic weapons because anybody could use them, right? You didn't have to be a samurai to know how to shoot with a gun, right? You did have to be a samurai to know how to use a sword to kill that way, things like that. But a gun, anybody could use. I'll read you what one Japanese farmer wrote about seeing the Portuguese with guns. He says, in their hands they carried something 2 to 3 feet long, straight on the outside, and it was heavy. Its shape defies anything that I have seen. And then he talks about how they shoot, how it takes the time, how they load the gun, and then this explosion like lightning, and you hit your target dead on. He said anybody who got hit by that would lose their life instantly. And then they also liked it because it was very Taoist and very Zen and Buddhist shooting a gun, right? You close your eyes, you kind of meditate, you take a deep breath, and you get your mind right, and then you aim and then you fire, right? So the Japanese loved their guns. Actually, and when Tokugawa pacifies the country, he takes people's guns as well as swords, right? So the only people who have them are Tokugawa's men. But they also loved other things, much like the Chinese. The Japanese loved tobacco, clocks, and of course glasses. Just glasses for seeing, just like the Chinese did. And they built castles. We kind of already talked about castle towns. This is a direct. Those castle towns are a direct product of Europeans landing on Japan. The problem was it was a very imbalanced trade. the Japanese were buying more than they were selling. It wasn't like China. This isn't a huge market, even though Ida was the largest city in the world. Europeans were not allowed there, so Japan was not a huge market like China was. So the Europeans didn't get much out of Japan except for they traded with them. They had an imbalanced trade with them. Okay, and this is called Nanban trade. This is basically what they're talking about. The Japanese are talking about trading with Nanban, or kind of foreigners or Europeans. One thing that did happen is with Europeans obviously comes Christianity. With the Jesuits comes Christianity. There were some conversions, but probably for economic reasons rather than actual religious reasons. Economic meaning the Europeans were bringing all of these goods from around the world, and these people wanted them, especially daimyo. In fact, one daimyo actually gives the port town of Nagasaki to the Jesuits, right? And he says, you can trade here and I'll give it to you as long as you trade with me. And then there were somewheres around, by 1580, 180,000 converts, they think. But at the same time, what was happening is Jesuits start behaving badly. The Pope sends them letters, so they start intervening in local politics, destroying idols, destroying Shinto shrines, Buddha shrines, and turning these places into churches. So the shogun felt like he was losing control, right? Here are these foreigners coming in when one of the main tenets of Shintoism is foreign ideas need to be kept out of our region, right? So the reaction was, in 1587, Hideyoshi Toyotomi forbids further activities in Japan because he says Christianity and these Europeans are corrupting the lower classes and they're destroying the Japanese tradition that we've had for thousands of years, right? And here comes these people who are killing it. He makes the Jesuits leave. The religious people had to leave, but the merchants could stay. But at the same time, you could only be in Nagasaki, and if you go back a few slides, if you want, you can see where Nagasaki is. It's an important port. So he lets the merchants stay, but in 1612, nine Franciscans were killed. Franciscans meaning monks, because they were causing trouble in Nagasaki. So Tokugawa closes all the ports except Nagasaki to the Europeans, and then he only allows the Dutch to stay. So I've already talked about how the Dutch kind of of all of the people, the Dutch behave themselves the best, so he allows them to stay. So as the Dutch are there, they know that they need to make themselves useful, so they begin to translate medicine, science, give them farming techniques, things like that, and trying to impart their wisdom, some wisdom on them, so they were allowed to stay. And Tokugawa does let them stay. They were there, but they were basically in prison. And if they proselytized or started trying to spread Christianity, they would be killed. Okay. And finally, Hideyoshi writes to the Portuguese, and in a letter he tells the Pope, or he says, send this to the Pope, you're the Portuguese, send this to your Catholic leader, that we have a God too, but he's the God of Buddha, Shinto, and Confucius. You only have one God and one underlying principle. And he said, we have three, so we are better than you, and we don't need your God, right? So he eventually kicks all Christians out if they try to spread Christianity. And obviously at this time, like we've already discussed, around 1600s, with Tokugawa and with the West coming in, the seeds of capitalism start to be planted in Japan. Unfortunately for Tokugawa, this eventually undermines him, undermines their family, but it takes, 250 years, because you can't really have feudalism and capitalism together, right? You can't have overlords and peasants with capitalism, right? Capitalism is money can be made by anyone, not just by the rich. And like we talked about, the merchants are benefiting from peace. Even though Tokugawa disdained merchants, and it's not a good way of life, according to Shintoism and Buddhism and Confucianism, they needed them because they made revenue on their taxes, and they kept the economy going. So places like Kyoto, Edo, Nagasaki became these huge manufacturing cities, and this population burst. And it's kind of like what happened in England, when we'll talk about with the Industrial Revolution, right? This banking and money started flourishing. Merchants started forming guilds and controlling the markets and paying their taxes, and this whole tradition of the warrior class and feudalism begins to go out the window. Even the power of the shogunate starts to diminish, because the traditions of Japan start to be a thing of the past. And for instance, the samurai class, basically by the 1800s, is gone, right? I think that's the topic for this movie, is that The Last Samurai. I can't remember when that was, but they become what is called Ronin, which is also a good movie with Robert De Niro. I shouldn't say also. Tom Cruise's movie isn't that good, but basically what Ronin are masterless samurai, or their wave men. They were let go of their jobs and they had nothing to do, so they kind of just roamed the countryside looking for work and becoming disdainful to society. So that's kind of the beginning of Japanese culture. We'll pick them up later, probably closer, kind of after the world, right after, maybe right up to or right after World War I, when they kind of become major players on the international level.